Welcome. You are watching Regional Wrap, episode 32, pre-recorded on Friday the 26th of November for release on Wednesday 1st of December. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on these issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, agriculture, growing produce or carbon credits. Is my guest, Professor Richard Eckard. Richard is the Director of the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, a joint research initiative between the University of Melbourne and the Victorian Department of Environment and Primary Industries. He sits on science advisory panels for the Australian, New Zealand and UK governments and the UN Food and Agricultural Organisation, specifically looking at climate change adaptation, mitigation and policy development in agriculture. Richard's research focus on strategies for reducing enteric methane and nitrous oxide from intensive grazing systems and whole of farm systems modelling of climate change adaptation, mitigation strategies in livestock production. Richard holds a number of industry as well as national and international science leadership roles, being a keynote speaker at numerous industries and international science conferences over the past few years. He's authored over 100 scientific publications and over 100 conference papers, with 50 peer-reviewed journal papers, and has contributed to several books. Richard's comments in relation to climate change impact on agriculture is often sought by the media, most recently in regards to contributions to meeting net zero 2050 aspirations. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate being here.
You could just start off and give us a bit of your personal history, where you were born, your childhood, how you got into your field, and some of the things you're involved in at the moment.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, look, I was born in a very small little country in Africa called Swaziland, or Eswatini now, to parents who were involved in research, mainly on malaria, actually, which is why I've had all the tropical diseases you can think of.
You're a guinea pig.
I was the guinea pig for malaria and bilharzia and yellow fever and all of those. But that sort of got me a love for the outdoors, for the rangelands, for agriculture, and ended up going to university and studying a degree in ruminant nutrition, and then into a master's degree on grazing management and a PhD in soil nitrogen cycling. But inadvertently, what that did is when the issues of climate change and agricultural mitigation came along about 20 years ago in my career, it allowed me to have a working knowledge of livestock methane, of soil nitrous oxide and nitrogen cycling within an animal, and how that can then be affecting emissions, but also understanding soil carbon, soil organic matter, and that all the aspects of climate change mitigation that farmers need to know about. It gave me a working knowledge across all of those.
And your transition from South Africa to Australia, how did that occur?
Yeah, inadvertent actually. Never planned to move. I was offered a research contract with the University of Tasmania, and I thought, well, you know, there's no other way you can see Tasmania and see Australia than go there. And after 3 years, the University of Melbourne offered me a contract, which I took up. And then your children grow up and they say, well, you can move, but we're not moving. So they were quite comfortable in Victoria. You know, ideally, I'm from tropical background, and this idea of winter rain doesn't really work for me. But that's where the family is. But you probably realize on carbon farming, I spend more time working in case studies in Northern Australia than in Southern Australia.
Well, when COVID sort of sorted out and that, you can get back to Queensland and come visit and dig in the soils here.
Some of my best visits have been to some of the big cattle stations up in the north, up in the Gulf country, and on the Downs, just helping with identifying carbon farming opportunities.
With carbon climate change aside, do you think agriculture was progressing anyway into a better format than it was done previously? Because a couple of weeks ago we had a local farmer, Jane Hawes, on, and she was into regenerative farming and syntropic farming, and it seems to be a lot of interest in those things. Do you think just setting climate change aside, were farmers sort of getting better at doing their job?
I think so. I think, if you think of most of the Southern Hemisphere, which was, developed agriculturally a lot later than the Northern Hemisphere, there was this attitude of let's move in and subdue the land and make it like European farming systems. And I think we've taken about 100 years to come to the idea that the tropics or particularly the subtropics and tropics are not like Europe, and you can't farm them like you farm Europe. And so there's been this steady switch from saying let's subdue the land to one of saying let's work with the land, let's work with the system we've got, let's work with the high climate variability we've got, let's work with the species we've got. So 100 years ago we were bringing in European grasses and African grasses. Now we're discovering, well, actually Mitchell grass is not that bad actually, and Thermida is pretty good. So why don't we work with what we've got? Because the inherent genetic variability and adaptability of Australian grasses is huge. I'll give you an example. Kangaroo grass, Thermida triandra. It exists in Hobart and it exists in the Kimberley. If something can teach us about adapting to a variable climate and a species that can adapt to a changing climate, well, Thermida could probably teach us a lot.
I think probably the other thing is just the rainfall problem. European farming, I mean, they pretty well can constantly guarantee a good rainfall, a milder climate, like cooler as well. But then we've got this massive land mass. It's not blessed with good rainfall in all areas, and even then, it's areas that are usually considered good rainfall. It's not actually reliable. So, have we been caught short in regards to adapting our techniques, and it's taken us a long time to get to that stage?
Yeah, look, you're entirely correct. 2 weeks without rain in Europe is a drought. 6 months without rain is not even a drought in Australia. You've got to be 2 years without rain before they declare a drought. And even when we try and compare ourselves to the rangelands of Africa, there's a massive difference. A lot of the rangeland systems and the grazing management principles that came out of Africa were principles that came from daily storm activity. So you could viably go in and graze an area and then wait for regrowth because there's been rain. A lot of parts of Western Queensland, the north, get 1 or 2 big drinks a year, and you've got to get all your grass growth out of that 1 or 2 major rain events in a year. So it's quite different, and the idea you can just simply import management practices even from Africa across to Australia is probably not correct. We need to think of it differently. Where they can go into sort of grazing rotations that you can repeat that every 2 or 3 months and expect regrowth. A lot of areas of Australia, you get 1 drink, you get all your grass out of that, and you've got to basically ration that out for the next 12 months. So it has led us into more, and you can see where terms like sustainability have kind of run their course over about 40 years. And yes, we are all changing the way we farm towards more what we would call sustainability. We've kind of also burned that term out. Everything's sustainable, including industrial chemical companies are claiming to be sustainable now.
Thanks.
And there's a new narrative emerging, and you can see the next generation of farmers coming along and saying, well, maybe regenerative has a better ring about it because it says we'll leave it better than we found it. What we've just got to avoid is this adversarial issue that seems to be emerging where you either a regenerative farmer or you're not, because there's a lot of farmers out there that are doing excellent practices that you could class as including regenerative principles, but wouldn't call themselves regenerative agriculture. And there is this unfortunate camp emerging that I think is unhelpful in encouraging most farmers to be more regenerative in practices they go about.
One of the concerns I had in regards to speaking to Jane Hall in regards to entropic, which is an advanced type thing on regenerative, is the intermixing of crops. And then to me, it seems a fairly expensive way to sort of manage the land. Although she was saying that she got productivity and was able to bring crops on at different times and keep picking. But a lot of these things, they seem to involve a lot of human interaction, and human interaction usually is labour, and that's a high cost item in Australia. And we sort of still do the regenerative type thing, but put it in any sort of mechanised way or large scale way, sort of keep those labour costs down.
Yeah, look, you're touching on something interesting there. A lot of the regenerative approaches are more focused on grazing systems than, or permanent pasture type systems than cropping or soil intervention. And one of the issues, if you look at the principles of regenerative agriculture, number one is don't disturb the soil. Now, unfortunately, when you're cropping, you have to. So if you want to be more kind towards soil organic matter, for example, you would look at less disturbance of the soil than you would have otherwise. So don't put serious disturbance through the soil, because you will just break up all the soil organic matter and send it back to the atmosphere as carbon. And so you'll find minimum tillage, for example, comes in, or ideas towards more perennial crops would come in. There's a big program of research on through GRDC at the moment about perennial wheat, because the simple equation is to build soil organic matter, for example. First of all, don't disturb the soil. Unfortunately, cropping requires that. Second would be put a crop in that can produce roots 12 months of the year rather than 10 months of the year. So the problem with annual crops is there's 3 months of the year that the soil is not receiving root material and growth. And that's the basic difference why we need to go to sort of more perennial, less soil disturbance over time. Grazing systems are wonderful like that, because they are permanent pastures. They're long-term plants that are growing perennially in the soil and occupy different depths of the soil with root material. Unfortunately, cropping just has that limitation.
Just as a matter of interest, like when the United States was first settled, because for some reason Europeans evaluated fertility of the soil with tree growth, when they settled across the United States, in the initial movement, they sometimes avoided the prairies. Yet I seem to read many years ago about the carbon sequestration in the American prairies, and it was quite huge because it was undisturbed. Obviously, they had fires and that before settlement, grass fires and that, but it regenerated and that, and the American prairies were a great carbon sink. Is that something we're sort of not catching on into in regards to the conversation? It's more about grasses with soil than it is trees, because we seem to have this big focus on cut a tree down, grow more trees, and sort of ignoring the grass situation.
Yeah, look, if you've got a cleared area, an area that's already has no trees in it, the fastest way to build soil organic matter is grassland. It would far exceed the capacity of trees to build soil organic matter. Now, trees obviously grow above ground, and you know, if you want to store carbon in wood, then you grow trees because they are the fastest way of growing above ground carbon. If you're concerned about building below ground carbon, there's no doubt grasslands put down massive root volume compared to trees and build soil carbon. Coming to your prairies example, there would have been a fairly high and stable soil organic matter in those prairies in the United States. And a lot of the dust bowl problems they had, you remember the big dust bowl
30s.
problems they had.
In the 1930s.
Yeah, and that was primarily because the early settlers went in and plowed up these long-term grasslands, and they oxidized. They basically broke down the soil organic matter that was there stable for centuries under those grasslands. And the moment you reduce soil organic matter, you make the soil more friable to erosion. And so the winds came through and just blew the soil away, which really emphasizes why permanent cropping, permanent grassland, building soil organic matter is actually so important for retaining soil. Now, there is a fundamental difference as to why a lot of those farmers in the Midwest of the United States are now able to go to minimum tillage and build soil carbon. And it's quite simply the time since land clearing. They've had about 150 years of destroying soil organic matter and then having the dust bowl problems. And then now they are at a very low base, say, 1.5% soil carbon. They put in permanent grassland, they go to minimum tillage, and they start building back to a more reasonable, steady state. In a lot of the grasslands or the areas of Australia, we've only had about 50 years, maybe 80 years post land clearing, post soil disturbance. And so we don't see quite the dramatic response to minimum tillage. What we're still probably eroding our soils down to a low point. And so minimum tillage is just stopping that from happening rather than actually rebuilding to a point. So it goes to the time since land clearing, I think, that has a big impact. So that's why you don't see as much of a dramatic response to minimum tillage in Australia. It doesn't mean to say it's not the right thing to do, because we've just got to stop this from happening. But we are in a different situation to the Midwest of the United States.
One other thing that's happened, especially up on the Cape region, that I've noticed is because of the Vegetation Management Act, there's been a lot of, farmers, graziers are prevented from cutting back regrowth. Now, regrowth of trees, like if you go up the Cape, you go up to Weeper, you can see for the road, there's established trees, but surrounding those established trees are heaps and heaps of saplings, and obviously they're all competing for the same water, the same nutrition, and it's adding stress to the environment. And the other problem is, because most of these trees are eucalyptus, they drop their leaf matter, and my brother-in-law is a turf farmer, and he hates gum trees because it kills grass like nothing else. The leaf matter is a real problem. So what we got, for not being able to cut down this regrowth, we're penalising the land by not being able to re-establish grasses, because that high volume of those saplings or striplings or whatever you call them are just overtaking the landscape, chopping their leaf matter, making it difficult for the grasses to get established, and that leads to erosion. But we don't seem to have any sort of answer to this in regards to the bureaucracy looking at it and saying, well, yes, you've got to keep your trees, but you can take some of the striplings out so you can consolidate your grass. Is that a reasonable assumption, or is that a reasonable request for the farmers to be able to do that?
Yeah, look, there's a fair bit behind that, and that's a very big issue. And I'll go out on a limb here on some of the things that I say, because it just expressing my view. No doubt, eucalypts use a lot of water, and there is some competition, and there is an ideal number of eucalypts per unit area where you actually get increased grass growth, and you probably could get increased animal welfare outcomes from reduced heat stress and things like that. There was a good program of work in the African rangelands looking at bush encroachment from acacias that came up with this idea of 1/3 thinning actually ends up with about the best outcome for the land. In other words, let's not clear completely, because they'll just come back. But if you clear, say, 2/3 of the trees and allow some individuals to increase, then you end up with healthier individuals, more carbon actually totally stored in tree material in the landscape, rather than these little ones all competing with each other. You get the shade and shelter benefits for the livestock, but you don't have the big competition with grassland. The other more controversial one is actually, if you look at land clearing regrowth, over 100 years, the carbon balance is about static because the trees grew, you cleared them, they grew, you cleared them, they grew. And there's a sawtooth that on average over 100 years, there's no actual net change in carbon. So it depends on your timescale. If you're concerned about, say, the Kyoto Protocol and why we achieved our target under the Kyoto Protocol, it was because we stopped land clearing of trees, and that carbon was considered to remain in the landscape. If you take a 100-year view of it, well, it was just a cycle of increase, decrease, increase, decrease. As we cleared, they regrew, they cleared, we regrew. So, you know, it depends on the policy timescale as to what you think is the right outcome. But I would say where we land up in the future in a more healthy, steady state is to say, let's look at allowing individuals, trees to mature to a greater size rather than have all these little ones across the landscape that occupy space that don't allow us grass growth between the larger individuals. That way we would get the best reproductive rates in livestock from heat stress and some shade benefits, because there's no doubt that a bigger tree provides some shade benefit through that cooling. And so, you know, we've got case studies of breeders in Northern Australia that actually put their cows into the tree paddocks in preference to get better reproductive rates. Can we build on that as a concept rather than saying trees are the enemy or trees are planted across the landscape?
You've got a bit of reverberation in your audio there. I don't know what's going on. I suppose the other factor is too, the regrowth also presents an increased fire hazard in regards to burn rate. So we've got a situation where we now got more and more leaf litter and other undergrowth that's got to fuel fire. So that probably needs to come into account as well.
The fire hazard is bigger where you allow lots of little individuals trees to come up. It's probably less if you have less trees, but it's also probably less if you have, you know, that 1/3 thinning I was talking about. I still think that's not a bad concept to start looking at as a way to slow down wind speed, to allow more shade and shelter, to reduce the competition effect by having single individuals that are larger rather than, you know, a large biomass of above ground trees that are small saplings that are probably going to carry a fire more.
You've still got a little bit of an audio problem there, Richard. And I'm not sure what it is. It's a bit of reverberation. Just moving on, we'll move on to one of the major topics. There was a recent story with the ABC where your comment was sought in regards to the government's 2050 plan and its assumption of carbon soil sequestration and the amount that benefit they've got would get from it. So I'll just show a slide. This is part of Australia making positive energy, and obviously the government, these things came out fairly quickly before COP 26. So the government's obviously had these things on the back burner for a while, but now some of their focus is on carbon soil sequestration, providing better management, affordable measurements, and their catch cry is it's additional income for the farmers and better agricultural productivity. Now, do you think it's a good thing for farmers to sort of start focusing on, I mean, they probably have to on carbon sequestration and soil carbon and getting funds from it? Or is there a danger that they're not going to look at what they're producing above the land and what their primary job is basically be there to feed people and with produce?
Yeah, you're touching on something fairly important here, and that is building soil organic matter is good for the health of our soils, it's good for future productivity, it's good for, there's no downside, all right? Soil carbon is only half of soil organic matter, only half of what's there. And you know, you could go to the extreme and say, if we want soil carbon, just burn it all and stick it in the soil as charcoal. But that doesn't give you any productivity benefit. It will give you confidence to sell it because it's permanent, but it wouldn't give you the productivity benefit. So let's not lose sight of why we want soil organic matter as agriculture in the first instance. It's for healthy nutrient cycling, good water retention, aerobic soils, good microbial activity. That's why I think there's a risk here, because we are seeing all the major supply chain companies setting carbon neutral targets for agriculture. Now, if they are setting targets, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture with current technology or emerging technology by about 80%. But that still leaves you 20% of the carbon balance before a farm can be carbon neutral. That's where your soil and your trees come in. Now, the problem is, if you're selling your soil carbon, what a lot of farmers don't realize, if you sell the soil carbon, it leaves your farm. It goes off to the law or the power station, who will then use it against their obligation. The day will come when that farm needs to be carbon neutral and they no longer have that stock of soil carbon because they sold it. They took short-term gain. Now, one area that does need clarification from government, and I don't have clarity on this, is if you sell your carbon credit back to government, it's fine. If you sell it to a software company or you sell it to a power station, you understand it's transferred, it's gone. It's not yours anymore. It's not in your soil. It's not part of your carbon balance.
You're dropping out.
It seems good on my side. The connection seems to be okay. Are you still getting something there?
Yeah, I'm hearing you now, but there's a reverberation, that's all.
Okay, I wonder if I change the microphone to a different microphone. Does that work as well?
That's better.
Is it better? Oh, good.
Yeah, that's gone.
Oh, well, let's try that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we need clarity on is if you sell your carbon credit or your tree carbon credit, your soil carbon credit, to a power station, or you sell it to a law firm or a software company, it's gone. It's left the farm, it's left this industry, it might even leave the country. So everybody loses. The farm will never be able to use that to be carbon neutral. And people don't understand that. What we don't have clarity on from government is that if you sell it back to government under the Emissions Reduction Fund, government retires that. They use taxpayers' money to buy it and they retire it against the national obligation. That means that no one's double counting. That means I think that the farm can still claim it, the industry can still claim it, and the nation can claim it. So we do need clarity on that when the government has this plan around soil carbon, because what we don't want is farmers offering up their soil carbon back to government and the government retiring it against the coal industry or the fossil fuel industry. Those industries have got plenty of money. They need to look after themselves. Farmers need those credits against their debt that they are going to incur in the future. So let's not get into a problem where we've sold all our carbon credits and when we need them, they're no longer there.
With the different schemes and that, how are they going to be operated? I mean, it has to be a baseline somewhere along the line, and then you get credits for what's already in there, or do you get credits for what you put in over the next few years, or how exactly does it work?
You're touching on a delicate issue here, because basically, if you have done the wrong thing and you've eroded your soil carbon down to a very low level, well, you're in a reasonable rainfall area, you've got great potential to rebuild that and claim carbon credits. If you are a grazier, for example, that's been in permanent pasture for a long time and you've looked after your grazing management and your soils and you've got good soil carbon, soil organic matter, well, you can't increase that indefinitely. You're at the top of the curve, and it's stable at a very high level. So this is the difference between stocks and fluxes. So you've got a good stock of carbon in that high, healthy soil, but it's not changing much anymore. It's just rainfall that's making the change on a year-by-year basis. So unfortunately, those farmers that have done the right thing can't get carbon credits for their soils because they've already got it all sitting there as a big stock. I would argue something different. I would say we're chasing the wrong target, because we've done some work to show that in a healthy high soil carbon grazing system, you're getting about $150 a hectare per year productivity benefit out of having high carbon. And the soil carbon trading benefit is only worth about $20 a hectare in that same scenario. So let's not get too worried about the farmer that's actually done the right thing and has a high stock of carbon in their soil. They are already reaping their reward in the better nitrogen turnover, in the better water holding capacity of that soil, and it's delivering productivity benefits that are orders of magnitude bigger than soil carbon credits. So if you are the farmer that actually has eroded the soil and you've got this big potential to build soil organic matter and claim carbon credits, you're getting the $20 a hectare income rather than the 150 that you could be getting if you'd just done the right thing from the beginning.
Okay, then now they're talking about in the brochure for the positive energy about carbon management measurements and also making them cheaper. Tell me about the sort of process for the carbon measurements in regards to establishing a baseline, I presume, on a property, and then how often would they be required to retake that measurement? And if it's gone up, how much would they get paid for it, or would they only get paid if they sold it on? Or if it had deteriorated, do they have a liability?
Yeah, all good points. Currently, the government's got two soil carbon methods available. One is basically you measure on day one and you measure at a later time. And if there's a difference, you can claim the difference. So that's measure before, measure after, I call it. It's fairly foolproof, but you know, there's a large upfront cost for a farmer to develop a baseline. So you could be spending $20,000 up to $200,000, one case I came across, on getting the intensive soil sampling done down to 30 centimeters according to the government's protocol. Now, the protocol is one of the highest integrity methods in the world. But because of that, it's quite expensive. The issue is you can take another soil sample 18 months later and spend another $20,000 getting that second measurement done. And if there's no difference, you can't claim anything because, well, there's no change in soil carbon, but you've spent $40,000 now. I would also say a bit of caution because 90% of soil carbon change is rainfall in Australia. And so this notion that after 18 months, you can go and take another soil sample and claim a difference in soil carbon, I would say the error in our ability to measure soil carbon is greater than the change you would get in 18 months. What I mean by that is you can go and take 5 soil samples, or you can do your baseline sampling on 5 different days and get 5 different answers that are about 10% different to each other, just because you're not taking the same soil samples and you're taking them in different places. You can send those samples to the laboratory, and the laboratory, if you send them 5 samples, you'll get 5 different answers that are about 10% different because the laboratory is not perfect. Add those 2 errors together and you've got bigger variance in your ability to measure soil carbon than you do in how much you can change it in 2 years. So it's a fanciful notion and a waste of money to go 2 years later and spend your $20,000 again and measure your soil carbon. You're better waiting at least 5 years where you are guaranteed that if you've done the right thing, there is a change and you can measure that change. So that's the one issue. The second issue is, yes, if there's a change, you can register your project with the Australian government, and you can do your baseline, you can spend your $20,000, you can then wait 5 years and go and do your second sampling baseline, claim the difference. If you then go into a drought, so say, for example, in this latest La Nina season, we've probably built more soil carbon in eastern seaboard of Australia than in the previous 3 years all put together. That's because of rainfall. If we go into a 3-year El Nino, we'll lose it all. So you might have sold your carbon credits because of this 1 12-month period of high rainfall, and the government issued you with Australian carbon credit units. You can then say, well, I'll just put them in my pocket and wait for a day when they're worth more money and then monetize them. Or I'll say, I'll put them in my pocket and I'll wait for when my supply chain tell me I need to use them to be carbon neutral. That's probably the best thing we can do right now. You can monetize them by selling them back to government and you get some short-term gain out of that. But then if you go into 3 years of drought, someone else is owning the carbon credit in your soil and it's gone backwards out of your control because of rainfall. Now, there is something called the carbon maintenance obligation. You don't have to pay the carbon credits back if it's just a drought. Same as the bushfire going through your trees, you don't have to pay the carbon credit back, but you do have to demonstrate that you will restore the asset back to where it was when you traded, which means you could find farmers sitting on carbon credits that they are spending the next 5 years rebuilding the soil organic matter or hoping for a La Nina season to rebuild the soil carbon before they can even think about claiming any more carbon credits.
It seems to me a lot of money is going to be spent and traded, but we're not going to see anything real tangible. I suppose that's a real concept for most taxpayers to get around, because usually it's going to be their funds and go out, but to them it doesn't matter if there's carbon in. They don't see any carbon in the soil. They don't, it's not a tangible for them. But the money going out this way and that way, it seems to be fairly horrific. And then on top of that, you'd have administration. We're just making another sort of big network of things that we've got to maintain, or the taxpayer has to maintain.
Yeah, look, that's why you hear me harp on quite a lot about just bank the inherent productivity benefit of high soil organic matter. There's no downside to that. It is good for the nation. It's good for the soils. It's good for future food health, soil health. It doesn't come with paperwork. It doesn't come with obligations. It doesn't come with penalties, carbon maintenance obligations, easements on your property, transfer rights when you sell the property. It doesn't come with any of that. Just build the soil organic matter and bank the inherent productivity benefits, which are orders of magnitude more value to you than selling carbon credits. Then one day when you need to be carbon neutral, you can say, well, look, I have built soil carbon from 20 years ago till now, and it's gone up 1%, and I can deduct that off my carbon balance. That's entirely valid to do that. But you still don't need all the paperwork. You don't need the contracts, the obligations. And I would say to farmers, just bank the inherent productivity benefit of high soil organic matter.
Well, I think that's one of the things. I mean, between government regulations on vegetation management, pesticide use, fertilizer use, it's just an endless sort of, the day never ends for them. Not only do they have to go out there and break their back and take the risk of what the weather's going to do with that, they've got heaps and heaps of hours they've got to spend on paperwork to satisfy bureaucrats for all different things. So what you're suggesting to me is maybe they just should stay out of the game as far as that goes, concentrate on the productivity of the land, and then if something comes along later that necessitates, then they can do it. But I just see it as a lot of paperwork for them, that they should probably spend their time better on their farm than doing the paperwork and all the hassle.
Yeah, look, I think this brings us to a point of discussing where the risks are versus the rewards. And excuse me, there are a lot of farmers that would benefit from diversified income, for example. And this is where I see a big difference between selling soil carbon as opposed to selling a methane reduction from your livestock, for example. They're quite fundamentally different, and the market hasn't wised up to the difference. There's a risk, and we've dealt with the risks of selling soil carbon, and a lot of paperwork and a lot of risk associated with that, selling something that is 90% leveraged on rainfall. If, for example, you improve the quality of your grazing management and you put in legumes and you finish your animals a month earlier, or they go to market 3 months earlier, that's 3 months less methane they didn't produce. There could be a good diversified income stream from trading that reduction in methane and getting paid for it, because there's no downside. You finished your animals earlier for market, you got paid quicker, you're more efficient as a result. Your animals were in better condition as a result. There's reduced methane going to the atmosphere. There's no risk of spending the next 20 years looking after that methane, because it didn't happen. You don't have to look after it as an asset sitting in your soil. It just didn't go to the atmosphere. So you can get validly paid for that under the herd methodology, for example. And then a co-benefit would be, if they went off 3 months earlier, you could look at 3 months worth of wet season spelling, or better recovery of the grazing condition of the land before you go into the next batch of animals. So I think we've got to look at the co-benefits. And I think even trees, for example, if you planted them cleverly across your property, or you allowed them to re-establish cleverly, you can get the shade and shelter co-benefit and bank that as a productivity outcome, and also get a carbon credit. It's really soils that I worry about the risk of, and the paperwork and the obligation versus the reward. But there are some valid projects that you can get involved in that give you diversified income with very little risk.
What about the temptation of commercial enterprises trying to get hold of these carbon credits? I think there's big enterprises like Google and that are trying to buy carbon from the soil, and entice farmers into it. Is that a problem where private enterprises in the scheme rather than just a government managed system? And how enticing are some of these company schemes on the farmers?
Yeah, look, they're very enticing, because right now we're in an obtuse situation where, because the Australian government goes into a blind reverse auction to buy carbon credits, they're using taxpayer money, they do that to drive the price as far down as possible. So we've seen prices from $11 maybe up to about $19 a tonne. The voluntary carbon market is sitting in Australia, sitting at about $30 a tonne. So you've got, and the European Union price is $90 a tonne. So you've got this obtuse situation where, if you go into a voluntary market trading with some software company, you use a method that has less integrity but is cheaper to get into and has less overhead costs, and you're getting paid double what the Australian government can pay you. So it becomes quite attractive. The problem is the sting in the tail is, once you've sold that carbon credit, it's no longer yours. We had a major grazing company talk, doing the rounds on the public forum, saying, look, we've made this major sale of our soil carbon off to a foreign software company, and we've got all this money, and look, we're a low carbon producer. No, they're not, because they sold their carbon. They're no longer a low carbon producer. The software company is. They can't claim that as being, they can't ever claim to be a low carbon producer anymore, because that credit has gone out of their system. You can't double count. You can't have your cake and eat it. So I think there's some major concerns there about that, because if you think about it from logic, you've got a farm that's sold a soil carbon credit to a software company, so the farm can't be low carbon. You've got an industry like the red meat industry that claims that's aiming for carbon neutrality by 2030. The more they do that, the harder it becomes for the industry to be carbon neutral, because they keep selling carbon credits out of their soils. They also becomes harder for Australia as a company to be low carbon, because these soil carbon credits are leaving and going off to Ireland or to the United States. So that's a fairly major issue. The other issue is the integrity of the method that's used is also questionable, because if it's cheaper and it has less obligations, it probably has lower integrity. And I probably need to tell you that the company that bought these soil carbon credits has now been formally informed that they should not be using them because the integrity is questionable.
We just move on to non-farming land. There seems to be, we've got governments that want to get more or lock up more land. We've got NGOs that are going in and buying former stations and farmland and locking them up. Is there a danger that these non-producing lands start to come into this carbon credit system as well? Can they do that?
In theory, they can, and that was never the intention of the original Carbon Farming Initiative. The original Carbon Farming Initiative had the intention of not impacting productivity. So there was always caveats built into the offset methods that made sure that you didn't sacrifice productive land, or that, like, for example, you couldn't claim a carbon credit by reducing your stocking rate. Reducing animal numbers by more than a certain margin was always built as a safeguard into the methods, because the intention was never to transform agricultural land into less productive land. And that's why it had bipartisan support. There are some tree planting methods that will allow agricultural land to go under trees. But again, I don't think the intention is to see major land transformation. If that does start happening, that becomes quite a concern. And I will admit there are some concerns at the moment about that, and that's what we do need to be concerned about.
I raise that because on the peninsula, we have had different NGOs go in and buy former cattle stations and grazing lands and then lock them up. Now, they're no longer managed at all. But do you see a system where maybe if they go into and actually manage the land, they don't actually produce cattle or raise crops, but they simply build up the carbon? Do you think that's a possibility as well? So although it used to be productive, it's now non-productive, it's not being used in agriculture, but it's there. Is there an avenue there for those NGOs to build the carbon soil and add to the reducing carbon emissions and getting paid for it?
Yeah.
Without planting trees, but just managing the property better.
Yeah, look, they would have to comply with the soil carbon methodologies. There's two methodologies currently. As far as I understand, both methodologies require it to continue being an agricultural productive system. So the idea of actually removing all the livestock and turning it just into a grassland, well, there's probably two problems there. One is, I don't think that would build soil carbon better than a well-managed grazing system. I'll come back to that in a moment. But secondly, I think that wouldn't be compliant with the method, because the method does require you to show that you are changing a practice to be better at building soil carbon under grazing. So there's still a requirement for grazing. The other notion that complete removal of livestock will build soil carbon better, I don't think the evidence is there. I think some form of well-managed grazing. Overgrazing, yes, you'll destroy the soil carbon. Undergrazing also reduces the rate of carbon input into the soil. So well-managed, good rotational grazing with wet season spelling or allowing species composition recovery does actually build carbon better than complete removal of livestock.
Well, we've got conservation groups who are doing this right around Australia, getting land and locking it up. And they're basically saying, well, they're improving the environment by just letting nature take its course. Is that a valid argument? Nature does a better job than us?
Look, I think if you're talking about completely undisturbed ecosystems, that could be true, because human intervention always does interfere with those cycles. The thing you've got to remember is a lot of our grazing systems, a lot of our agricultural systems are quite heavily disturbed. they have been intervened. They don't have the species composition they had before. You know, so yes, if you are taking on a property that has largely the original species composition, the original soil microbiota, hasn't had a lot of phosphorus fertilizer applied, you could make an argument that the total carbon balance in the landscape might be better because, well, you don't have that intervention. Where we've actually changed the species, or we've got some fertilizer inputs, or we've had grazing management for the last 100 years, I think we've got to accept that that's a changed system. And so we've got to work with what we've got. Yes, we can restore it back to a better, healthier species composition. But now that we've got grazing animals in there, actually keeping that cycle and managing it better, because more productive grasses will lay down more soil carbon over time. So yeah, look, I think there's a balance to be found there. But it does go to, you know, once you've disturbed the system, you've got to manage the system you've got.
I'll just, of course, we're talking about grasses so much, I'll just show a screen. That's a biological carbon sequestration cycle. But it's quite strange. A lot of people don't understand how much root material is under the ground, and in some instances, different plants, you know, seem to be able to, their root systems, you know, reach anywhere but, you know, 2 or 3 meters below the ground. So what you have 70 or 80% of the grass system is actually under the ground. So that's the big advantage with grass systems.
Yeah, correct. That's why you'll see if you're in southern Australia, you've got European introduced grasses, you generally work on about 2 to 1, ratio of 2 above ground to 1 above below ground of mass. In northern Australia with the tropical species, they're much deeper rooted. And so you've almost got the reverse. You've got 1 unit above ground and 2 units below ground. And so if you see a tropical grass growing 0.5 meter tall, you're pretty sure that it's got double that amount under the ground because of the more challenging conditions. And so if you look at the root volume under a good Mitchell grass or Rhodes grass type grassland system, there's a massive volume of roots sitting under the ground there, more so than there would be with trees, for example. Trees hold more above ground carbon, but grasses below ground carbon. So I think that's quite a significant point to make. Grasslands do have a very effective root system, and that's really good for holding soil in extreme weather conditions. It's good for holding soil in floods. It's good for holding soil in droughts, for example. It's you know, so I think the volume of roots is a very healthy part of grazing systems. The other thing to remember is how grazing systems, I tend to think of them as a potential carbon pump. What I mean by that is, it comes back to the earlier comment about the zero grazing is probably not as good as some grazing. Because what happens is when you graze a grassland, you graze it right down and it can't get a lot of energy out of the sun because there's not a lot of green leaf left. So it draws on energy reserves in the roots and it draws up those energy to put out new green leaf so it can start photosynthesizing again. In doing so, it actually sloughs off, it breaks off root fragments and leaves them as organic matter in the soil. When it starts growing above ground and captures energy from the sun, it regrows and reallocates energy back to those roots, so the roots grow down again. Then you graze it off and it sloughs off the roots again, you get some fragments left behind, and you can see over time how controlled grazing management would actually drop fragments regularly into the soil as soil organic matter. And so that's why I see some managed grazing that allows good energy reserves in the plant would actually be better for the soil in leaving soil carbon behind than no grazing at all.
In regards to your concern with the government's assumption of soil carbon sequestration, do you think there will be a time when they'll have to review their assumption and sort of maybe curtail their hopes and maybe spend money on zero emissions in some other area because it's not going to deliver what they expected? Or how do you get the government to sort of put early enough so it doesn't become a problem?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues wrapped up in there. The one is in the estimate of how soil can save the day, there's no accounting for future climates. And we already know from a number of studies that increase the temperature, reduce the growing season rainfall, and you erode soil carbon. So I would go so far as to say that in southern Australia, where there's a strong rainfall signal already of reducing growing season rainfall, we would struggle to hold on to the soil carbon we've currently got, let alone the idea that it will save the day in some future climate. So if you build climate change itself into the estimates of soil carbon potential, you've got to be more modest about the expectations. The second one is the concept of offsetting is being challenged in the science community right now. So we're about to see a challenge to say soil carbon sequestration in trees and soils is just making us lazy in actually doing what we really need to do, which is reduce coal emissions and reduce power station emissions and reduce transport emissions. And so there's coming a challenge to say, no, you can't just offset your emissions. You have to actually reduce your emissions, and that in future, by about 2030 or 2040, we'll be using our offsets, our tree and soil carbon, to pull the atmosphere down from 450 parts per million, rather than say we're just going to hold it there by being lazy. So I would say we have a very limited period where offsets will be acceptable as part of your carbon balance. There'll come a day somewhere before 2050 where they will no longer be acceptable. You just have to reduce your emissions and stop being lazy by saying we can just offset.
Well, I think the current figures for carbon dioxide atmosphere is about, I think it's up to about 420 now and still heading north. It will probably continue because China, India and that are going to. So what do you think is a reasonable point that we can get to and sort of hold that level? Do you think we're progressing at two parts per million at the moment? Do you think we'll still rise? Do you think we'll go up somewhere between up towards 500 and then be able to hold it and start bringing it down, or we just don't know?
Yeah, look, it's a big unknown because it really depends, like you say, on the large industrial emitters, and they fortunately the big ones have actually made some serious commitments. You know, China and the United States have made some big commitments, but China is still building new power stations, new coal-fired power stations as we speak. So we will increase. We will increase at least to 450 parts per million before we start reacting. I am the eternal optimist because I think as humans we've got a history of under-responding to a crisis and then over-responding to a crisis. And at the moment we're still under-responding. We still don't take it seriously enough because we haven't seen the penalty yet. But all it takes is a few very large natural disasters as a result of climate change, and we will then over-respond. And there are already, you know, wild technologies out there where people can build reverse power stations, where they can actually build these large plants that are run on renewable energy that actively suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into solid material. So, you know, you could imagine by 2040, we realize how serious it is. And suddenly all nations in the world are building these reverse power stations to pull us back down and get us out of trouble. So I am the optimist. I actually think, you know, agriculture has a part to play, but the bottom line is we've got to get away from coal and oil as quickly as possible and build an industry where we export renewable energy technologies to the world.
I suppose my position is that we've already got this great device by nature that sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores it solid, and that's trees. But the thing is, in Australia, we don't want to harvest and store that tree in building materials or something like that. But which is strange because, I mean, if you go through Europe, you go through many towns and that, you see timber beams that have been there since, you know, 1300 or something. So they've got a magnificent storage life and use life for storing carbon. Do you think maybe we should also step up in regards to managing our forest better to harvest trees and encourage new growth to suck up more carbon? Is that also a bit of a viable situation? Because we can store that carbon in wood for a very long time in a lot of applications.
Yeah, look, you're touching on something very, very important there, and that is using timber in a sustainable rotational basis. So, you know, look after our native forests as well as we can. Don't allow any more incursions into those. But you know, if I was a farmer looking to be carbon neutral and I could reduce my emissions by a certain margin, but you can't get them to 100%, you can plant sort of as a livestock property, you could probably put 10% of your farm down to trees, but in 20 years' time, you need another 10% because that stock is still there. Or you could look at saying, well, if I harvest those trees as construction timber and it goes into a house frame or furniture, 50% of what was standing above ground is now locked away permanently for the next 100 years in construction timber. That allows me now to replant on the same area, get revenue from selling high quality timber, and claim that 50% carbon that went out into the construction timber as part of my carbon offset on my property. I think that is entirely valid and viable as a diversified income stream for farmers.
Well, I also noticed that a lot of people looking at CO2 sequestration straight into the ground, and had some success, but gee, it seems to be fairly expensive. I mean, if worse comes to the worst, we could cut a tree down, wood chip it, and just shove it down a coal mine, and old used coal mine, and bury it, and it's locked away for thousands or millions of years. So we've taken it out of the environment altogether.
Well, you know, you could probably say if it was worth doing and that was available, you would use the tailings rather than the actual expensive wood. So, you know, when I said 50% of the trees that are standing there, 40 or 50% lands up in a long-term store in timber, in housing frames or something. There's another 40 to 60% of tailings that, you know, you could do. Well, another useful use of that is, you know, if you're a farm near a sugar plant, for example, you could then put that into biomass burning and displace fossil fuel energy by actually burning the tailings as a renewable energy source rather than, you know, you could put it down a mine shaft, but you could also use it as a displacement of fossil fuel energy.
I think there's a lot of innovative things around available to us, the future, if we give time and application and thought and planning to it, and sort of rather than get caught up with some of these big cost quests in regards to sequestering carbon dioxide by itself into old oil fields and things like that.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of reliance on carbon capture and storage, and you know, it's been around for 20 years, and the problem is it sounds like a great idea, but I don't see any power stations taking it seriously. I don't see an engagement of the large emitting power stations in saying, yes, we're going to move down this route. There's just a big divide there, and while a lot has gone in, I think there's a very large part of the science community would say it's never proven itself to be cost effective, and not the least of which, one of the big projects that we had down in the Otways was actually trying to measure the leakage back out of fissures in the rock from carbon sequestration, carbon storage in deep mine shafts. So, you know, there's this risk that you go to all that expense of sticking it down into a deep mine shaft and it just leaks back out to the atmosphere. So, you know, I actually think it's just, again, it's lazy technology. You know, sorry about those people who've been involved in it for many years. I think it's trying to sort of give us a loophole to continue bad practice instead of saying, you know, that industry has had its day. Let's put money into reskilling the people working in that industry to get a far brighter future in a renewable technology industry that doesn't have to worry about sticking CO2 underground, that it's just using the natural sunlight and wind and wave energy we've got around the country to generate something far more productive for the future.
is some of our reluctance also, or our propensity to go for these odd schemes, that sort of are unproven, look very costly, and that is in Australia. Is some of that just caused by the fact that we're so adverse to, say, nuclear energy as an option?
Look, I think we are. I think there's a large revenue stream from selling coal. It's massive. It's a very big part of the economy, and we can't deny that. And that's the problem, say, governments have got, because it's a massive industry. Having said that, none of the major banks would put money into it anymore. And so, we're seeing the financial sector with their fiduciary responsibilities and wanting to move to a world where they have no exposure to greenhouse gas emissions risk. So, big issue there. I just think that we're living in the past if we think that that is the future. The world's moved on. We're going to have to move on.
Well, maybe we've got to go through the hardship of going through all this wind and solar energy and deal with its unreliability and its infrequency and intermittency before we actually get to the stage and say, well, we need to go to nuclear. That will probably be an unfortunate situation that we've lost so much time. But in regards to carbon and carbon soil and carbon credits, we'd just like to wind up on that now. So can you just reiterate your advice to farmers in regards to dealing with the opportunities and the dangers of those opportunities in the future with carbon credits and dealing outside the government system?
Yeah, so, by all means, get involved in carbon offsets if it's diversified income for your farm, if it's about methane reduction, if it's about genuine sequestration, maybe in trees that have co-benefits. But when it comes to soil carbon, we've got to be aware of the risks. There is no downside to building soil organic matter because it's just part of healthy future productive soils and productive agriculture. Better water holding capacity, better nutrient cycling, everything that you can bank without paperwork. When it comes to selling soil carbon credits, you've got to remember that there are big risks. One is rainfall. It's 90% leveraged on rainfall. And if you have a drought period, you're going to lose it all. So that presents a risk. Secondly, there will come a day where that soil carbon becomes very important for your own obligation as a producer to be carbon neutral. And so the idea that you're selling it out to a third party through a voluntary market to get short-term gain, well, first of all, it's not part of your mainstream productivity, and you're taking your eye off the ball on what you're actually there for, which is farming. Secondly, it's a risk that you now have sent out an asset that you then have to manage in your soils for the next 25 years to make sure that somebody else's asset in your soil remains there. I just don't see that that is something that farmers should be taking the risk on. And that, yes, by all means, get involved in other offsets, which might be real reductions in methane, tree planting, but I just see soil carbon as a major risk, given that its reliability is really leveraged on something we don't control, which is rainfall.
And I suppose the other thing is, outside the government market, you would probably be dealing with people who are slick salesmen. So you'd have to be extra careful in regards to what agreement you come to.
Yeah, look, let's not label all the carbon aggregators in that category, but the problem is there are some that are highly trustworthy and others that you probably just want to go and verify the estimates that you're being promised. So buyer beware. always get third-party advice on where to go and who to help. There's no doubt we need aggregators in this space because there's a lot of paperwork involved. Unfortunately, they also need to be paid. So that means you get less of the carbon credit revenue. But an aggregator is quite essential unless you are a big enough corporate that you can pay your own aggregator to internally. But if you're a family farm or a smaller business that want to get involved in the carbon market, yeah, there are very good aggregators out there that will do a great service for you. But some of the estimates you're given might not be real, and the expectations are might not be met.
But really, for the farmer, the carbon sequestration in their own soil, the best benefit for them is their own productivity.
Yeah, fully. And you know, to me, if it was me, I would be saying I'll bank the $150 of productivity value per hectare, and I would ignore the carbon market. And then one day when I need to be carbon neutral, yes, by all means, get a baseline done on your farm so that you know what your soil carbon is, so that in some future environment you can use that against your own obligation. There's no downside to getting a baseline done on your property so you know where your carbon is and you know what your opportunity is to change that. But to go into trading that, I think it's just there's more of a risk.
Okay, Robert. Richard, thanks very much for your time. I'll just wind up the episode now, and I have a little talk to you after. If you have enjoyed tonight's episode, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next week.